This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, gets the show rolling with a grain market outlook. He talks through pre-report expectations for the prospective planting and grain stock reports. The show continues with K-State Assistant Research Professor in Swine Nutrition, Katelyn Gaffield, as she discusses soybean products in the swine industry through research supported by the United Soybean Board. She explains if differences in soybean meal quality impacts pig growth performance. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show with a weather forecast. He says what weather roller coaster we will likely experience in the coming week. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, starting off our conversation, touching on some pre-report expectations as on Monday, March 31st, we're going to see some more USDA reports.
Yeah, there are times in the market year where important information comes out that really catches the attention of traders, and the prospective plantings report at the end of March. Well, it's a time and key data that gives at least the first signal of what planted acres will be for these various crops this year. And on Monday we have that, and also the grain stocks report. But first, for the acres numbers, the USDA had come out earlier in its Outlook conference and indicated they were expecting about 94 million acres of corn to be planted, and that compared to last year, that would be up about 3.4 or so million acres. The trade has come out now in pre-report trade estimates and is estimating that there'll be about 94.36 or 94.4 million acres. So if anything, they're a little bit higher. It's interesting to see the range of what's expected. On the high end, 96.6 million acres, and as low as 92.5. So if anything, I've heard more people personally or in the airwaves of ag market discussions talking about anything from 94.5 to 95 or more million acres of corn. So you've got that type of momentum, that type of that train of thought coming in. The safest bet is to say, well, we'll go with what the USDA said, but we'll see where that goes. And then the acres that would be going then to corn would be coming out probably in the U.S. Corn Belt, coming out of soybeans largely. So the USDA had indicated again in their outlook form about 84 million acres of soybeans to be planted, and actually the trade is expecting about 83.7. So by about the same amount that the trade estimates for corn are above what USDA had said, the soybean numbers are lower than that. So there's about a difference of opinion of about 360,000 acres. So not a lot. So we'll be watching that, of course. They will come out with wheat estimates, wheat acreage estimates. They'll be using the winter wheat numbers from the January or earlier winter wheat seedings numbers, but what will be the key factor in the market will be the other spring wheat and durum numbers. Now, not listed right here. We in Kansas will be watching grain sorghum numbers. Overall, the USDA is their initial shot back in late February was to take down the grain sorghum planted acreage figures by about 300,000 acres down to 6 million acres. So we'll be watching that out here in the West. It's between Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas where most of that grain sorghum's grown. So that'll be pretty important for us. The other side of the market information that's coming out that day will be in the quarterly stocks reports. And at least for me, Shelby, I'm thinking that we've got a pretty important moment in the grain markets to tell us if low prices for sorghum, if low prices for wheat have brought about or encouraged any increase in feeding of those crops relative to corn. So the trade estimates coming into that report are for about 8.15 million bushels of corn to be fed. That Deese number was about These first figure was about 12.007. So the difference, we're expecting about 3.9 billion bushels of corn to be used after we take out exports, after we take out ethanol and wet corn milling. Then the difference will give us an estimate of how much was fed. So that's the best way to look at it. So we'll be watching that number close. Also be looking at wheat. Again, low-priced wheat. At one time earlier this year, we were hearing a lot of discussion in western Kansas around the feedlot areas of wheat being fed well, and with slow exports, gosh, it was there to be had. So I think we'll get some idea whether that actually occurred during that Dece through February timeframe. So both the old crop supply demand balance sheets can potentially be affected by what comes out on Monday, and in those numbers through the quarterly stocks and usage, the Dece-Feb usage, as well as expectations for the coming year, as we look at the major acreage planted of all these crops.
What are we seeing when we look just at the Kansas grain market? Kansas
grain markets are not doing very well. just be honest, and that follows from I guess a lack of movement, positive movement in the futures generally overall. We've been trending sideways to somewhat lower on the corn, hard red wheat, soybean futures, and the cash markets are showing the same. Small amount of improvement in corn basis in some areas. Again, up about a nickel stronger in the Garden City area, our demand center in the state for corn basis. New crop bids also about a dime over from the Dece corn futures figures. But most other prices really pretty, I guess, sideways to lower relative to cost of production figures. So prospects right now for new crop bids for corn, and again with the highest for corn at say 410, 425, 430, or 420 in a lot of areas. Here 450, the best bid in Garden City. We're covering direct costs for sure, but full economic costs are at risk with both the land and the machinery costs not doing so well. Then for other crops, grain sorghum all lower, down at everything below $4 for the best prices. A lot of them at $3.75 at the top, $3.75, $3.85 at the top, $3.65 to the lower side. So right in that time frame when planted acreage estimates are just around the corner for anybody planting feed grains, they'll look at corn, they'll look at sorghum, they'll look at the cost structure of both crops, and they'll see basically a situation that isn't very attractive for either one. But in terms of managing risk, corn has if we get rain, has high yield prospects. If we don't, grain sorghum's less expensive to put in generally. That's as a generality. I would also say for soybeans, best prices, $9.87 in Topeka for cash prices, but everything else at $9.52 or $9.45 out to the west, $9.07, $9.27. So not a lot to yell about there. And wheat, with again green up, crop risk just around the corner for wheat. We're seeing cash prices in the west actually below $5. Both the Colby and the Garden City area still at $5.36 or so in the central part of the state and east central, Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson, and Pittsburgh about right at $5. So again, not great prices by any stretch. If anything, right now the corn price has fallen off enough for new crop bids that we're seeing actually an increasing trend towards favoring soybeans in the Salina area, Topeka area in particular, getting more to even in Hutchinson and still favoring out to the west the feed grains, of course. So just interesting to look at all these trends. And I think the biggest thing to remember is that it's spring. I would add in, although we haven't talked much about weather of late, it is dry across most of the U.S. So on the one hand, man, we're going to make great progress planting these crops. But on the other, if moisture doesn't come, and then you have heightened uncertainty and fears about what will happen this summer. So you got a kind of a two-edged sword. Strong progress, but gosh, we'll be looking for weather and rainfall as we move off into April and May and June.
And Dan, as we're thinking about the grain market, wanting to give us maybe a little bit more insight into soybeans for today?
Yeah, my own thoughts are that the USDA's projection of 52.5 bushel per acre U.S. yields are probably pretty strong. They're looking at, again, about 80 84 million acres planted of beans in this year. And by the time you look at all that and recrank through the numbers, et cetera, the USDA's projections for about 320 million bushels of ending stocks, about 7.2% stocks to use, and a $10 price. If you follow my train of thought and think that's pretty strong, then there's probably a 1/4 chance, about 25%, that we'll actually get that. If we get more of a yield along the lines of 51, like we have been getting, particularly when we see some pretty dry conditions, then you take that, the supply-demand balance sheet down some from 320 million down to 250, stocks to use just under 6, and prices closer to 1150. I think there's about a 40% chance that that's going to happen. And take it even further down to 49.5, not that terribly low, but still lower yet than 51, but 30% chance of that. And you're down to below 200 million bushels of ending stocks, even with some rationing, and prices closer to 13. And of course, there's the 1 out of 20 big drought year, and that's then you're looking at far higher prices then. But that's 1 out of 20. We have a major drought. So my own perspective shall be that I think that the USDA's projections right now are for strong trendline yields on the high side, are at least worth questioning. And at this moment, we need to, watch the weather, see how the crops develop, but really look at more of an average yield at this time to at least give credence to where that would take us. And that's probably taking us to something higher price-wise than what we're seeing right now. Big limitation in the market is what's happening in Brazil, anticipated record crop. We'll see if that actually shows up to the degree they're talking about. Trade tensions, all this has the market worried, but overall, I would wonder about what seasonal risk and uncertainty will bring us in coming months as we get these crops in the ground, and then hope for rain to get things going and have a good crop in 2025.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about soybean products in the swine industry with K-State Assistant Research Professor in Swine Nutrition, Katelyn Gaffield. Katelyn, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Katelyn, what research have you been doing when it comes to soybean products in the swine industry?
Yeah, recently, the Applied Swine Nutrition team has taken an interest in looking at soybean meal quality. And soybean meal quality has been something that's heavily studied because soybean meal is one of the largest used protein sources in swine diets. However, recently, our team has taken a new approach to looking at soybean meal quality and have actually been evaluating factors that haven't been evaluated previously.
What are some of those different factors that you're looking into?
Yeah, one of those factors that I actually studied during my PhD with the team is looking at soybean byproducts. And these are specifically the byproducts from oil refinery. And so we can get soybean gums or soybean soap stocks. And what's really interesting about these oil refinery byproducts is that we actually found that they can be added back to soybean meal. And so the first thought that came to our mind when we learned this is how does that ultimately impact the soybean meal that we're then feeding to the pig?
And what different variations did you see of these different byproducts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we actually conducted a large industry survey where we looked at the different byproducts. And so we actually, with the help of the United Soybean Board, sampled from 15 different processing plants to look at the variation of both the soybean gums and soap stocks. We also took a sample of the soybean meal from those plants as well. And the most interesting finding is actually how large the variation was. And so even just as we were getting the samples back, just visually, they were very different in color and viscosity. And so that really piqued our interest. And then when we actually evaluated those samples, we found pretty large differences in the fat content, which would be important when we're adding it back to diets, as well as the moisture content. And so when you think about how that will impact transportation of feed or ingredients.
When you say nation, across like the whole nation or just Kansas you looked into this?
Yeah, so we actually evaluated the samples across multiple different soybean processing plants, and so that would be across multiple different states. And so we really tried to get a comprehensive view of what these byproducts were doing to our soybean meal. And so when we actually evaluated, so those byproducts had a lot of variation. When we actually then looked at the soybean meal, we then saw differences in the soybean meal due to adding the byproducts back. And so what we saw was that we had an increase in fat in the soybean meal, ultimately when we added those soybean gums or soap stocks back. However, we didn't see a change in the crude protein level. And so essentially those plants are going to add those byproducts back until they hit their either limit that they can add back or until they're worried about getting too low of a crude protein content in the soybean meal.
Did it impact pigs at all?
Yeah, so that's actually our thought process. So we saw this difference in soybean meal, and we saw this increase in the fat content, and we're so like maybe this additional energy actually may be a benefit to the pig instead of thinking of byproducts being a negative, right? And so we did conduct a nursery study looking at adding these byproducts back to soybean meal. Then we incorporated that soybean meal into the swine diet. And ultimately what we found was that there was very little differences in growth performance when we fed the soybean gums or soap stocks in soybean meal to pigs. And so this is a good finding for producers because it indicates that you don't have to worry about sourcing different soybean meal sources and if you have byproducts be included back. Additionally, we actually found a little bit of a positive, especially in that late nursery period when we started including higher levels of the soybean meal, so inherently higher levels of those byproducts. We actually saw a slight positive increase in the average daily gain due to the addition of the gums, which we believe the gums had the best benefit because it had that higher level of fat content in the byproduct itself. So maybe we are seeing a potential benefit to the energy, and so no concerns with sourcing it for your swine diet, and maybe even a potential benefit if you add it at high enough inclusion levels. But we definitely need to evaluate that further before we can definitely say it has an improvement due to energy.
Did the addition or different variations of soybean gums, soybean soap stocks change their fecal output?
Yeah, and so we also did evaluate the fecal dry matter, and that was one of the things we were concerned with nursery pigs and scouring due to the soybean meal in the diet. But actually we saw no differences in the fecal dry matter when we added the byproducts back. And so we not only saw no differences in the growth performance, but we also saw no differences in the fecal dry matter, indicating it wasn't really negatively impacting their health or giving them a GI tract type of challenge. And so we found that as a positive when we're thinking about understanding our soybean meal quality from that aspect.
So even with those different variations, once it's given in the diet, really no variation then for the swine industry or for nursery pigs?
Yeah, and so specifically with the byproducts, we didn't see it translate into any differences in the nursery pig. And we have to remember, and a key point of this is that the byproducts are still being added back at relatively low levels. And so when you're thinking about how these byproducts are being added back to soybean meal, they're only added up to around 2%. And so when you think about that on a complete diet for a pig, you're actually having relatively low levels of these byproducts. And so ultimately, even though it has the energy content, we saw these large variations, it kind of gets diluted out in the diet. And so ultimately, we didn't see any negative effects there.
What are you hoping to look for in the future?
And so in the future, and kind of piggybacking off some of the variation we saw in the byproduct study, we wanted to look at soybean meal quality across, just in general, across multiple different factors and even more plants for this next study. And so again, with the support of the United Soybean Board, we're looking at a larger industry survey specifically focused on soybean meal quality. And so this time we're sampling 30 soybean processing plants, and we're looking at all types of soybean quality parameters. So from your as basic as the proximate analysis, all the way to measuring things like the oleosaccharides or anti-nutritional factors such as trypsin inhibitors in the soybean meal. another aspect that we're also looking at that unique to this survey is also some of the analytical variation. And so not only are we looking at the quality of the soybean meal, but how do we best measure the quality of the soybean meal? And so we're measuring this in triplicate, quadruplet sometimes across 4 different laboratories to really give people the best recommendations when you're sourcing your soybean meal. How do you measure that so that you can have the best understanding possible of your soybean meal quality that's then going into your swine diets?
As we're thinking about soybean products in the swine industry, then, Katelyn, what are those few key points you'd really like to remind swine producers of?
Yeah, I think the key takeaways that I have from our current research looking at soybean meal quality is first that there is some variation in soybean meal quality. However, when it pertains to those byproducts, once we include it into the swine diet, that largely has a little impact. So producers don't need to be concerned about sourcing soybean meal with gums or soap stocks in particular, and you may even see a benefit due to that. Additionally, our team is trying to look a little more at the soybean meal quality and other factors besides those byproducts. So looking at anti-nutritional factors. And so keeping those in mind, because those may have a bigger impact than the gums and soap stocks. And so that's what we're looking at next. And then finally, we're trying to understand how to analyze the soybean meal. And I think that's a key takeaway as well, is understanding how you're analyzing your soybean meal and where you're analyzing it, so then you can have a better understanding of those results that you're getting back.
Katelyn, you are newer to the K-State Swine Extension team as an assistant research professor. What are you doing? What could people reach out to you with questions for?
Yeah, and so with the team, I've joined the Applied Swine Nutrition team for about a year now, and I've been leading up a lot of this area of soybean meal quality research for our team. And so any questions pertaining to soybean meal quality or the measurements, I would be happy to talk about, as well as we have some other research, which I haven't discussed here today, looking at trypsin inhibitor levels, as well as looking at startup soybean meal. And so there's other research or information that I could provide as well if there's questions in those areas.
Katelyn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That was K-State Assistant Research Professor in Swine Nutrition, Katelyn Gaffield. If you have questions about this research from Katelyn or other questions for Katelyn, you can reach out to her via email at gaffield@ksu.edu. That is GAFFIELD@ksu.edu. I will link this contact information in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to ksuswine.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you after the break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, what kind of weather have we seen in this past week?
Well, it's been dry. Seems to be a reoccurring theme that we have week in and week out over the last several weeks. You know, we looked at that snow cover that we had a couple weeks ago that melted off pretty quickly, and things have really dried out since then. Overall picture across the state, above normal temperatures. Our average temperatures are in the low to mid 60s, and we've had temperatures 75, 80 degrees plus, depending on where you're at. And even the overnights, Thursday morning in the Flint Hills, the overnight low temperatures were in the low 60s. Overall temperatures have been consistently above normal. And then we also have seen some lighter wind days, and that's a nice reprieve from some of the stronger wind events we've had so far in March. But that's also allowed the opportunity for folks to get out in the field and do some burning in the Flint Hills especially. So there's been a lot of prescribed fire. And now that the winds have picked back up again, keep in mind that those fires could still be burning. And we will really have a dry landscape across the region. That means the grass and especially the timber can hold heat for a long time and continue to burn and smolder. So as these winds come back up late week and into the early weekend, we expect potential for escape fires. So just go out, make sure your fires are put out. And we've had conducive fire days. It doesn't mean every day is conducive. It's still Kansas, it's still spring. We see those strong winds. And winds are going to return as we go kind of back into a roller coaster we'll talk about in a minute. But overall, warmer, drier, and some light wind days, and now the wind has returned again.
So with those warmer temperatures and lack of moisture, seeing some more drought expansion?
Yep, we again had drought expansion across the state. We saw a 10% increase in moderate drought across the state. Now we're approaching that 50% of the state in moderate drought. And that's not exactly ideal when we are going into a period that we average more precipitation in the spring, but we've been talking about these long-term outlooks for a while, and it's expected to be drier than normal through the spring for most of the state. That's not exactly an ideal recipe when we look at drought conditions continuing to expand now and combined with those warmer than normal temperatures. It's just increased stress. Vegetation starting to green up too, and that's starting to use up all the soil moisture that we have that's below the surface. And therefore, that starts to quickly degrade our drought conditions as we go into spring. If we can't keep up with the atmospheric inputs, the atmospheric rain events, we really, really depend on this time of the year. So the hope is that we can get some of that. The forecast is optimistic for some folks. At least we're introducing the chance of storms now. We have had some scattered storms in eastern Kansas over the last several days. They've been very widely scattered, though. And so the rain amounts were very localized, maybe a half inch here, half inch there. As we move forward, it looks like we're going to keep storm opportunities, especially for this weekend. We have a low pressure system that's going to move across the state on Saturday. That'll bring a cold front through, and we'll have thunderstorms initiate along that cold front or just ahead of it in eastern Kansas. Some could be severe, actually, as we move into Missouri. And then as we go into Sunday, some of that wraparound moisture will potentially provide some light rain and maybe some more thunder showers for the northern half of the state. As we go into early next week, much cooler temperatures behind that cold front on Sunday and then Monday, maybe a potential for some freeze. Folks are thinking about planting. Soil temperatures are still in that mid-40 range when we look at 7-day average temperatures at both 2 inches and 4 inches. So we're not quite there yet, and that freeze potential there Monday morning is a good reminder of that. And then we'll quickly warm up. We'll warm up on Tuesday and Wednesday with some strong winds out of the south, and that'll play into the next storm system that looks like Wednesday into Thursday. That'll bring another cold front through, another chance of storms, and maybe some rainfall again. But then cooler weather, and it looks like still, though, unsettled weather as you go into the middle of April. That would align pretty well with the overall pattern shift. We had this brief period of quiet weather at the end of March, but now things are going to increase, and we're going to see at least potential precipitation opportunities, but unfortunately no real widespread wetting rain appears likely for the entire state at any one time.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.